Hello, everyone. I'm pleased today to have as my guest discussant محمد Hijab. And this discussion has been postponed a number of times because of illness, and I'm very glad that we're able to do it today. And I thank him for his patience in continuing to pursue this and being willing to talk to me, despite, I think, being delayed 3 times, which is one more time than is unforgivable. But in any case, محمد Hijab is an author, a student of comparative religion, and a philosopher of religion. He's the co-founder of Sapience Institute and is a researcher and instructor for that organization. He has a BA in politics and a master's degree in history. He's acquired a second master's in Islamic studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies. Hijab has also completed a third master's degree in applied theology from the University of Oxford, where he focused on the philosophy of religion in applied settings. He's now doing his PhD in the philosophy of religion on the contingency argument for God's existence. And many people, I was looking a while back for people to talk about Islam with, and many people recommended that I talk to محمد Hijab. And so I talked to Mustafa Akyol a couple of weeks ago. He's known more, I would say, on the liberal front. And so I'm very pleased to be able to talk to محمد Hijab today. Thank you very much for joining me today. It's very good of you to put up with the delays. So
No. Thank you for having me, honestly. It's always a pleasure.
Well, so I'm going to ask some really basic questions because it's very difficult to understand another culture from the outside. You also have, as an outsider, you have no idea how much you don't know about what you don't know. Even you're blind to your own ignorance. And so I'm going to start with basic questions. I wouldn't say that I have a tangible understanding of Islam. I mean, I have some understanding of Christianity. I've been able to get the sense of Christianity at a reasonably deep level, I would say, at least compared to other things I know. And I've kind of felt the same way about certain aspects of Buddhism and Taoism. But as a religious system, a system of thought, Islam has remained relatively opaque to me, despite the fact that I've done a reasonable amount of historical reading. And so what is it in terms of practice and belief that are absolutely core, as far as you're concerned, to practicing the Islamic faith?
Well, the first thing is, I think we should start with the bare bones basics. And the bare bones basics is first to say that we believe in God. And the kind of God we believe in is one God, worthy of worship. In fact, the Quran makes a series of arguments, rational arguments, for why we believe in the type of God that we believe in. For example, in chapter 52, verse 35 of the Quran, it says, أَمْ خُلِقُوا مِنْ غَيْرِ شَيْءٍ أَمْ هُمُ الْخَالِقُونَ أَمْ خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ بَلْ لَا يُوقِنُونَ. Were they created from nothing or by nothing? Or were they themselves the creators of themselves? Did they create the heavens and the earth? They have no certainty. In other words, the Quran is hinting here at the fact that it's impossible for something to come from nothing. And it's impossible also for something to give rise to itself. And so the universe, for example, if we take this as an example, couldn't have come from nothing, and it couldn't have created itself. It couldn't be self-generating and or self-maintaining. And there can't be a world, in fact, the Quran would indicate, there cannot be a world with only dependent things that require other things in order to exist ad infinitum. And so what is required outside of the series of dependent things is something which is independent, which all things depend upon, and which itself depends upon nothing. And this is what the Quran refers to as as-samad, or the idea of God being self-sufficient and independent. So the idea of God,
so it's a prime mover argument, and you think
it's a kind of prime mover argument. A lot of
why do you think that the same argument that you put forward in relationship to the generation of the universe can't be put forward as an objection in relationship to God? You know, because you make a logical case that something can't come from nothing and something can't create itself. But you from a philosophical perspective, this isn't a religious critique. From a philosophical perspective, you just move the problem back one step. What advantages do you think there are to moving the problem back one step, or am I mischaracterizing it?
Well, I'll tell you what, Dr. Jordan Peterson, what you said is very similar to what Richard Dawkins said in a debate with the Archbishop of the then Archbishop of Canterbury. And he said that, well, if you have, and he said this debate, he made this argument in Oxford, and he said that if you look at the universe, well, if you're saying that God has made the universe in this way, then your God, who's more complicated, and he would add this layer of complexity, your God who's more complicated would require an even greater he would require an even greater explanation.
Or the greater God.
Yeah. So really interestingly, Anthony Kenny, who's an agnostic himself, he's a philosopher and agnostic, he came in and he said, well, actually, take a look at this. You've got an electric razor, which is made up of many different component parts. And you have a cutthroat razor, which is made up of one part. And he said, although the electric razor is more complicated, it serves less functions than the cutthroat razor, because the cutthroat razor can cut your throat and it can also cut an apple, for example. And so it's a fallacy to assume that just because something is complicated or that something has many features and attributes, that thing itself requires an explanation. And in fact, if we had an infinite regress of such explanations, then obviously that would lead to a kind of absurdity. So even well-meaning atheists and agnostics in the field realize the redundancy and the fallacy and the argument that is put forward by the likes of Richard Dawkins, who said that kind of thing. And I would also add to that one point: the argument from composition, which is usually a corollary to the contingency argument, usually is made in the following way: that everything that is made of parts is contingent, that the universe, or say a multiverse, is made of parts, therefore a universe, or the universe and or the multiverse, is contingent. The parts that we're talking about mereologically here are things that can be attached and detached. So that doesn't apply to God. Classical theism doesn't say that God is made of parts the same way as human beings are, or as universes are, or multiverses are. And in fact, the Quran hints at this itself. It says, الَّذِي خَلَقَكَ فَسَوَّاكَ فَعَدَلَكَ فِي أَيِّ صُورَةٍ مَا شَاءَ رَكَّبَكَ. That the one who created you and composed you and configured you in any form that he wished, he put you together. And so the fact that you have such configuration in the universe indicates to the fact that you have an external sorting agent that has particularized the universe in a certain way, and that has composed the universe in a certain way. So the argument really is that things which are made of attachable and detachable parts, that those things are contingent. That doesn't apply to God on any theistic paradigm. Now, what we would say, though, sorry to kind of drag this on a little bit, is that this would disqualify something like the Trinity from being true. And in fact, the Quran, this is the Islamic position, is vehement in its opposition towards a triune God. So, for example, in chapter 23, verse 91, it says, مَا اتَّخَذَ اللَّهُ مِنْ وَلَدٍ وَمَا كَانَ مَعَهُ مِنْ إِلَهٍ إِذًا لَذَهَبَ كُلُّ إِلَهٍ بِمَا خَلَقَ وَلَا عَلَى بَعْضُهُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ. That God hasn't taken a son and he doesn't have any gods with him. If that had been the case, each God would have taken what he has created and they would have tried to dominate one another. The idea, therefore, that there can be more than one all-powerful entity is an inconceivable and unintelligible idea from the Islamic paradigm. So it's seen as problematic, to say the least, or conceptually impossible to say even more, to suggest that something like a Trinity can be true. When it's talking about, for example, Mary and Jesus, it says something very simple: كَانَا يَأْكُلَانِ الطَّعَامَ, that both of them used to eat food. So in other words, the impossibility of something limited like Jesus, a man, being God at the same time, being unlimited, because the definition of God is that he's unlimited, is all powerful.
Do you think that there's a divine spark in human beings?
No, but we don't think there's any kind of divinity at all. Islam is categorical about this, because the way we define divinity is extremely strict. We say that the divine attributes of God are specific only to God. So nothing else. What's
the characteristic element of the human relationship with God?
So
and what's the central what would you say, structure of value within a human being that makes them worthy of respect, say, in the sight of God, or worthy of value in the sight of God?
The Quran states, لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. We have dignified the child of Adam. So that we do believe in something called human exceptionalism. We do believe that human being has been specialized or specified among all other things in creation to be to have free will, for example, to have a personal relationship with God, to have a loving relationship with God. People don't realize this, especially from the Christian tradition, but one of the names of God from the Islamic tradition is that he's the loving one, Al-Wadud in Arabic, in the Quran as well. So we believe that the relationship that human beings should have with God is a loving relationship, but It's one of submission. This is the main thing. Islam doesn't mean peace. Islam actually means submission. Islam comes from the root Arabic word istislam. And what it means is submission. And really what the picture is in the Islamic cosmology is that everything in the universe is submitting to God. Everything, the laws of nature have been placed there by the lawmaker, which is God. And so we as human beings are volitional. We do believe in free will, but we also believe in a theological compatibilism. And so that a kind of predetermination is actually one of our pillars of faith, to believe in that. So in that sense, we have to voluntarily submit to God in the same way that everything else in creation is.
And what does that submission mean?
What that means is that all the prophets and messengers came before time. So this is the meta-narrative of Islam. Abraham came, Moses came, Jesus came, and all of them came with exactly the same message. And that message is to worship, to believe in one God and to worship in only one God. And to do that, you have to follow a guidance. So each and every single one of those messengers, they came with, we believe in our narrative, they came with two things effectively. They came with a message, which is to worship God, meaning to submit to his laws, and also with some kind of evidence base to suggest that they are prophets. So some of these stories would have been known, obviously, to you. You've done a biblical series, so I know you're very aware of those stories. We have very similar stories, like in Moses, Abraham, Jesus, but they are slightly different. Those stories are slightly different. In fact, sometimes radically different, especially considering some New Testament kind of narratives. And so what the thread that joins, or the flesh that joins all of these kind of messengers and prophets, is that they all came with one fundamental message, which is to believe in one God, worship one God. We believe that the Prophet Muhammad...
So hang on. I'm still not understanding this exactly.
Okay.
I'm not sure what you mean by believe. Like the way you laid that out was in some sense propositional, right? You made a logical argument for the existence of God, but you take the existence of God as given in some sense to begin with because of your faith, and then you provide your belief with a rational argument, but it wasn't derived from a rational argument. And so when you talk about belief, do you mean belief in a set of propositions about the nature of God? And if you do or don't, what do you believe, and how would you separate out that belief from what you term as worship?
Right. So actually, there's one thing that ought to be known, that in Islamic theology, we believe in something called the fitrah, which is an innate instinct to believing in God. And now, I'm not sure if you're aware of the work on it.
So why bother with the propositional arguments then? To me, they just seem like a side venture, to argue with scientists.
Some scholars have said that in Islam. Sorry, I apologize.
Yeah. Okay. No.
In fact, some modern day philosophers of religion have that kind of a stance, like Alvin Plantinga. He seems quite, agnostic about the whole thing. I mean, the thing is, what we're saying is, it would be committing something like the naturalistic fallacy to suggest that just because something is the case, or there is ought fallacy maybe, just because something is the case, that it ought to be the case. So in order to prove it's a demonstrative proof for those who are in what we call shak or doubt. And but the truth is, as you've mentioned, and as in the literature, like for example, Justin Barrett has this in his cognitive psychological or cognitive science literature. I'm not sure if you've come across his stuff, but basically what he says is that we have an innate, his words exactly, receptivity to believing in God. In 2011, the Oxford Anthropological Society, they'd done a huge study of 32,000 children. And what they found was that children innately and intuitively, instinctively have a belief of a higher power of some sorts. Now, they're born with that belief. And in fact, in one of the papers in Justin Barrett's book, he literally mentions the fitrah, or the Islamic theological concept of an instinct in believing in God.
What's his last name?
Barrett.
How do you spell that?
I think R-T, I believe.
Justin Barrett. Okay, that's useful. Yeah, well, it just strikes me that you see, the problem with debating people like Richard Dawkins about the existence of God is that he will formulate the argument in propositional terms and then force the person, so to speak. I don't imply any malice on his part, but as soon as you accept that the the battle is to be won on propositional grounds, you've already accepted a certain definition of God. And I think you lose the argument instantly. I think the argument for instinct, something like that, is much more powerful. Because one of the things I'm led to wonder when you laid out your argument is, well, what purpose does belief in God serve, or your faith in God, let's say? And I think belief, see, it's also really interesting to try to distinguish between belief in something and faith in something. Like if imagine you have faith in the good. And so how do you demonstrate that? Well, you believe that good is more powerful than evil. You believe that you should act in a manner that's appropriate to the good. And so then you act that way. And that's the faith. The faith is demonstrated in the actions.
Yes.
But it's not exactly propositional. And, partly because I would say, if you look at good and evil, for example, it's not that easy to make the case that good is more dominant or more powerful than evil, all things considered, in human affairs. Now, I think it is, but you know what I mean? You can't make a compelling propositional case that that's absolutely true. But you can reflect your faith in your actions.
The thing is, you mentioned Richard Dawkins. I wrote, as part of the Sapiens Institute, we wrote a small booklet called The Scientific Delusions of the New Atheists. And we refuted him on these kind of things. If you read the God Delusion, he literally spends 5 pages of hundreds talking about the cosmological argument. And I think 2 talking about the teleological argument, or the fine-tuning argument. I do think that not much work has been done by new atheists, meaning like, the Four Horsemen or whatever, in trying to actually tackle these arguments. And sometimes when they're on debates with other philosophers of religion, I don't think they, from my perspective at least, they don't actually provide a satisfactory defense.
Yeah, well, the instinct argument is an interesting one, because it seems to me that part of and this is why I was pressing you to some degree on the issue of the definition of worship, is that I don't see much difference between the instinct to worship and the instinct to imitate. And I do believe that there's compelling evidence, psychological and biological, that we human beings have a remarkably strong instinct to imitate. And the question is, well, what is it that we're oriented to imitate? And I think if you look at the developmental psychology literature, for example, it seems to be the case that if a child has an intact nervous system and they have 1 or 2 good models around them, that they'll be drawn towards those good models and imitate them and develop quite healthily, even under rather stressful circumstances.
Yes.
And, that instinct to imitate also underlies phenomena like the experience of awe and the experience of charisma. And that charisma, has an effect on attentional function and on the proclivity to behave. And so I think the propositionalized arguments deliver the religious ideas over to the propositional camp, and that's dominated already by scientists in many ways. It's a losing battle. I don't think it's the right one. So worship, so one thing the West and Islam agree on, although I think Islam is part of the West, by the way, because we're all people of the book. I mean, the triune God in the Christian sense is still subordinate to a higher order unity. And so there is a powerful movement towards monotheism in Judaism and Christianity and Islam, and that seems to be a point of some agreement. We're also, all 3 societies are also people who've made a decision collectively in some mysterious manner that a book should sit at the basis of culture, a specific book that's been aggregated in a strange way, in a mysterious way. And so we also agree on that. And so that's a starting place, at least. And obviously there's been a lot of interpenetration of ideas between Islam and Judaism and Christianity. I mean, the prophets in Islam are the same prophets that go through the 3 major Western monotheistic religions.
Yes.
And so that's a fair bit of commonality.
Yes.
And so that's a good place to start building bridges. And so Islam is stringently monotheistic. And then the submission idea, what exactly, I mean, God is ineffable in a sense. And so what does submission mean exactly?
Right.
And how is that related to worship? And how is that related to the good, let's say, on a practical level?
Right. So I think what you said before, there was a point you made about defining faith through action. And I think that we would strongly agree with that. And that's what we believe. Our definition of faith is what basically believe in the heart, say on the tongue, and do with your actions. That's like a definition of faith for us, or iman, the idea of iman. In terms of the good, now there are different conceptions in Islam of the good, but the main thing is we believe that God is good, quite similar to what Christians believe, and therefore he wants good for human beings, and that the injunctions of God are also good. In terms of submission, and this is extremely important here, submission can only be done through revelation. That is our position. The position is that submission is actually impossible without a guidance, and the guidance we believe obviously is the Quran, but we also acknowledge the Torah, the original Torah that was sent to Moses, and the original Injil, or the gospel that was sent to Jesus. But what we have is, you can call it a doctrine of tahrif, which means corruption. So what we believe is that what happens is, with these books, you've had basically corruption happen to them. So we don't know what is part of that book and what is not part of that book. We don't know exactly what Jesus said and what isn't, because there is no clear chain of narration back to Jesus Christ. But going back to the point of submission is to follow the prophets, all of them, because a Muslim cannot be a Muslim unless they believe in, revere, love, and respect all of the prophets, including Jesus, Moses, Abraham, and all of them. Follow all of them and in their way. And once again, we believe that they were divinely inspired. So, and there is evidence that all of these prophets come with. And I think I was on that point when I was telling you that the differentiating factor between the Prophet Muhammad and the rest of the prophets is, we believe, whereas all of the other prophets came for their people and their time, we believe that Muhammad came for all people and all times.
Yes, well, that's certainly what Christians say about Christ.
Yes, but in the Bible, you'll find some verses that are saying, I've only been sent for the lost sheep of Israel. And so,
yeah, there's some tension. You see this, yes. You see something like the rise of a spirit of universalism that surpasses fundamental tribalism, even of a religious sort. And there seems to be a struggle that takes place in the gospel, in some sense, conceptually, between this reversion to something that's more tribal and something that's genuinely universal. But I think the universalist spirit wins out quite clearly. I mean, otherwise Christianity wouldn't be an evangelizing religion. It's designed to try to bring everyone under the fold, let's say.
Tension, sorry. It's largely because of the tension between Paul and James. And a lot of, modern day Christianity is based on Pauline kind of interpretations, rather than kind of, James was very much a man of the law himself. He didn't believe that the law was abrogated. He didn't believe that, in fact, there's huge tension, obviously, in the Bible between both those two men. And obviously, there's historical reasons for that as well. But what we will say is, we would say that there are clear verses in the Bible, like, for example, we point to Isaiah 42:11, where there indicates a new prophet that's going to come. And in fact, Isaiah 42:11 in particular is extremely important, because it even specifies the region. It says it will be sent to the people of Kedar. And the people of Kedar, as in Genesis, Kedar was the son of Ishmael, and basically from him is the lineage of Muhammad, or the Arabs, if you like. And so there's a whole discussion in the whole of Isaiah 42 about a new prophet going to come, and he is going to come to the people of Kedar, and the people will be rejoicing on the mountaintops. And in fact, the name of a mountain in Medina, which is present-day Saudi Arabia, is mentioned, which is the Mount of Sela. And so we would say that actually Muhammad was a continuation of Jesus Christ, and that Jesus Christ as a prophet, also in the Bible, doesn't say that there's not going to be another prophet after me. And so there's no reasonable reason for us to think it all ended.
Well, I think Jesus. Christ actually said that believers would be able to do the things he did and more. So there's actually a prophecy of a multitude of prophets in some sense, which would perhaps be a consequence of taking the fundamental doctrine, the spiritual doctrine of Christianity seriously.
Yes, I mean, as we said,
interpretation.
In many ways, we are all followers of Christ, and that's another point of commonality. Like we see the Messiah, Jesus Christ, as a man who had done wonders and miracles and signs, as the Bible states. We believe that he was immaculately conceived. We believe that he cured the blind. He raised the dead with God's permission. We believe most of the things that you'll find we actually believe in those things. There's huge commonalities between Islam and Christianity from that perspective. The major difference is we would say that it's not intelligible or conceivable or pardonable to believe any human being with a date of birth could ever be called God. And this is where we kind of diverge from the Christian mainstream.
Yeah. So okay. So let me tell you about some things I've been thinking about in relationship to that. Well, you know that Nietzsche announced the death of God in the late 1800s, and you know what the consequences of that have been, at least to some degree. And of course, Dostoevsky was talking about exactly the same things at pretty much exactly the same time. But the philosopher of religion, Mircea Eliade, in his historical investigations, indicated that the death of God is something that has happened to many cultures in many places over many times. It's not a unique event in, let's say, Western history. And his explanation for that, at least in part, was that as there's a movement towards unification under a monotheistic umbrella, let's say, which is perhaps a precondition for the union of diverse people, one of the consequences of that is that central unifying value becomes so abstracted because it has to cover such a multiplicity. It becomes so abstracted that it becomes sufficiently, it flies away. And he called that Deus abscondus, if I remember correctly, is that the idea of the spirit just flies away because it no longer has an attachment to the world. And one of the ways that Christianity solved that, if you think about it from a psychological perspective, was by insisting upon the presence of God in a kenotic form, right, in an emptied form, in a partially emptied form, in the person of Christ, in a particular place and a particular time. And it's a variant of the prophetic idea, although taken to its absolute extreme. The prophetic idea is that there are people who are marked out in history, marked out by God, by their relationship with what's highest in some spectacular manner. And so I guess one of the things I would say about the Islamic resistance to the idea of the divinity of Christ is that there is an emphasis on Islam on the special status of prophets, of certain prophets, and their particular special relationship with God, which seems to elevate them above other men in some important sense. And drawing a line precisely between that claim and the claim of divinity incarnate is not an easy matter. So, well,
I would actually disagree with that. I think there's a clear distinction in the Quran between the prophets and ordinary men. This is actually one of the clearest distinctions. Because
yes, but is there a clear distinction between the prophets and some spark of divinity inside those men?
Yeah. So what do we define as a spark of divinity?
Well, I would say it's partly what gives people charisma, although it's not always that. It's also partly what marked these men out as being prophets. I mean, it's what we look at when we say that man is great. That's a great man. That's a great person. That was a great deed. Well, yes, fair enough. But I would say also embodied virtue. And it's embodied virtue that is in some sense reflective of the action of the highest value operating at a local scale.
Yeah, so that's exactly what we believe. We believe in the doctrine of infallibility, or isma. And so we believe that all prophets basically did the best thing possible for human beings. And this is narrated about the Prophet Muhammad. In fact, وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ, the Quran in chapter 68, verse 2, that, and you have impeccable virtue, basically the highest level virtue. And this is something about all the prophets. And obviously, if that wasn't the case, there wouldn't be sufficient guides for us in terms of humanity. So if that's what you mean by a spark of divinity, then I don't think there's a point of resistance.
Yeah, well, these things are hard to sort out, right? The terminology, and that's part of the complexity of these sorts of discussions.
For us, divinity is basically having the attributes of God. So once again, since we know God through his attributes, from that perspective, that human beings cannot possess the fullness of the attributes of God. If you want, I can recite.
No, that seems like a perfectly reasonable perspective. I mean, we're all limited, infallible creatures, and we'd be fools not to see that. The attributes of God, how are they knowable? Is that only through relationship with the book, or does that also have an experiential element as far as you're concerned?
So what I can do, in fact, is I can recite for you a couple of verses from the Quran, because what we believe is they are known through the revelation. And I can recite for you maybe 10, 20-second verses and translate for you and show you what, I think it will give you more of a flavor of what we believe.
Sure, do what you will.
So the Quran states in the end of chapter 59, هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو عالم الغيب والشهادة هو الرحمن الرحيم هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو الملك القدوس السلام المؤمن المهيمن العزيز الجبار المتكبر سبحان الله عما يشركون هو الله الخالق البارئ المصور له الأسماء الحسنى يسبح له ما في السماوات والأرض وهو العزيز الحكيم. So let me read the translation from because I don't want to get this wrong, right? These two verses I think are probably the two best verses that answer your question in the Quran. Allah is He. I'm going to get something maybe a bit better. Translation. All right. Mahsen Khan. He is Allah, that there is no God worthy of worship except for Him, the King, the Holy, the one free from all defects, the giver of security, the watcher over His creatures, the mighty, the compeller, the supreme. Glory be to Him. Glory be to God. High is He above all that they associate as partners with Him. He is Allah, the creator, the inventor of all things, the bestower of forms. To Him belong the best names. All that is in the heavens and the earth glorify Him, and He is the Almighty, the All-Wise. So these are, I would say, potentially the two best verses that summarize for us.
Yeah, so it's an attempt to use a multiplicity of virtues to define a supreme source of good. So, okay, I have a technical question for you, a procedural question, I guess. When we're talking, so you sang those verses, and then, so here's what happened. I asked you that question. You sang those verses or chanted them, or a combination of those two. Okay, but there's a melodic element to that, and I don't understand the language, and then you translated them. And so why approach the answer to my question in that manner?
Because we believe that the Quran in its original language has an element in it, or has a virtue, if you like, to it, or an attribute to it, which cannot be felt or experienced phenomenologically, if you like, through just mere translation. We believe that.
And so what purpose does that serve in the discussion with someone like me?
What it will do, hopefully, because we believe the Quran has divine qualities itself. The Quran itself has divine qualities. So we believe, number one, it's a cure. We believe it's actually a physical cure as well as a spiritual cure. We believe that it's a guidance. We believe that it's something which will literally put you in a psychological state of ease. So in a sense, what it will do, it hopefully, will have an effect on you, which is physiological, maybe psychological. And in a sense, it's like giving you something to taste rather than just explaining what it tastes like, and so that's why I feel it's
how do you know when that's appropriate and when it's not?
It's always
you obviously don't all the but you don't.
I don't mean that. I mean,
no, but so that's why I asked the question. It's obviously you're making distinctions. You're not doing what you just did with
what
me.
It is your piece, and I want to give you.
Your mouth.
I want to give you the full Islamic experience. You see?
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough.
Do you know what I mean? So, so part of it is to let you hear what the Quran sounds like. So you can kind of, if you hear it, maybe you go somewhere to a Muslim country and you hear that in the background, or you maybe even walking down. I don't know. You're from Alberta, is it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Amazed you know that.
Yeah, I think you've mentioned it before. I've been to Edmonton, actually, in Canada. There's a Muslim community there. Maybe you'll hear it in someone driving there, and I remember that. I know what that is. So it's just to gain maybe.
So why did that make you smile?
Because that would make me happy. I mean, quite openly and honestly, because we want the best. I mean, to be honest with you, if you want me to be totally honest, yeah.
Well, that's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah, all right. What you asked me before we started the show. I mean, one of our not objectives, but one of our hopes, okay, is that people embrace Islam and become Muslims. Islam is an evangelizing religion. It's a religion which aims literally to enter every home. There is actually a prophetic saying that says that Islam will enter every home, not necessarily meaning everyone will become Muslim, but it will enter every home in some way, shape, or form.
You mean like what's happening right now with this podcast?
There you have it. You see, it's part of it. No, there's a series of predictions that the Prophet makes, and this is part of the evidence package, we believe.
Okay, so you also talked about the fact, when we started, just before we started this, that part of the reason that you're talking with me is that you hope to build bridges. And so this gets down to some, and I want to return to the fundamental attributes of Islamic belief. I don't want to let that part of the conversation lag, but Christianity is also an evangelizing religion, and Christians hope the same thing.
Yes.
So, well, you know what that has caused and is still causing. And so, we have to contend with this, all of us that are alive now. And so we have two evangelizing religions. They're both fundamentally monotheistic. They emerge from a tradition that's quite similar. There's many things that they have in common, but the border between them has been rife with conflict for a very long time, and that has not ended. And it's become more distributed and so forth. And one of the things about Islam, I would say, that frightens the West is that especially in the modern world, is that it appears that it's difficult for religions that aren't Islam in Islamic countries to manage to maintain themselves to any degree whatsoever. And now, look, I understand. I said that with a certain understanding also in mind. When I look at this from a psychological or an anthropological perspective, I also see that as human societies have come together and organized themselves in ever increasing sized groups, that the necessity for an emergent monotheism as a uniting factor might be crucial. And it's clearly the case that the emergence of Islam united diverse people. Yeah. And in that union, there is a kind of peace. That's the definition of union. And how much strife and force and conflict and catastrophe had to attend that unification is a matter of debate. We don't know how these things can be managed. We don't know how to manage them any better. But we're still stuck with this problem. Now we have two fundamental monotheisms that are head to head. No, that's an oversimplification. And hypothetically, we're both motivated by the desire for something approximating peace.
Yes.
And we want to build bridges, and that's why you and I are talking.
Yes.
But I don't know what to do with the mutual evangelical, what would you say, impulse. Like, my sense is, Christians, turn to yourself. You're a problem. You can fix yourself. You do that, and the other things are going to sort themselves out of their own accord. And I do believe that. And I actually believe that message is in some sense centrally Christian. It's like, look to yourself and be the example. And that's the best way of, let's say, convincing other people, if that's what you're interested in. It's also the only real effective way of bringing peace. So, well, I'm not sure.
Well, look, I'm a traditionalist Muslim, okay, which means I'm orthodox. I'm not a liberal at all. In fact, I oppose liberalism, to be quite honest with you, in the sense that I criticize it. I don't think it's the truth with a capital T. So a lot of Enlightenment ideas, I oppose them openly, right? And so I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who is a traditionalist Muslim. And by that I mean I stick to the Quran and the Sunnah, which is the prophetic sayings, and the jurisprudential tradition, which is derived from those two sources and other sources as well.